2 lost fortresses on the banks of the Mississippi.
Something bigger than just the passage of time has taken an even heavier toll on these buildings.
A concrete monster that withstood a fierce bombardment.
These structures are so massive, they're so well built, you can't get rid of them. You can't level them, you can't tear them down, you can't blow them up.
And a ghostly ruin that's home to an eerie presence.
There are reports of apparitions in the corridors, and that's no surprise. It has that kind of feel to it. If you ever want to visit a haunted mansion, then this is it.
Decaying relics and ruins of lost worlds. They were forged through years of toil, but now they are haunted by the past. Their secrets are waiting to be revealed. Overlooking the sea on the north coast of Wales stands an imposing castle.
This looks like something out of a medieval fairy tale, like a home for princes and princesses.
It's a grand palace of a building with so many rooms, embattled towers and amazing windows. Somebody clearly wanted to impress and make an impact.
But as striking as it appears from the outside, it's only on the inside that a visitor really feels the creepy atmosphere.
If you ever wanted to visit a haunted mansion, this place has got it all. You've got your gothic architecture, your faded grandeur, your air of mystery and terror.
Rumors of hauntings float around the place, and every wall tells a story. Marriages gone terribly wrong, battles, and children fleeing from cruel and deadly fates.
But the story here isn't quite what it seems.
What's strange is that although it looks ancient, there's parts of this building that don't look that old at all.
You can see this was once a glorious structure, but now it's just crumbling away and disintegrating. It's as though the life has been sucked from the place.
It looks so sad and abandoned. What went wrong here?
These crumbling walls hide tales of vaulting ambition, stories of families at war, and accounts of people saved from certain death. Without doubt, there's something very odd about this great stronghold.
There's some clever trickery at play here, because it's clearly been made to look like something it isn't.
Dr. Mark Barker is an architectural historian. He spent the last 20 years investigating the castle's deepest secrets.
So this looks like a medieval fortress, but as we look around, we'll find out that there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Inside, there are features that betray its true age.
So one of the telltale signs that you can pick up looking around the building that it's not as ancient as you think are the windows. And the windows are made out of cast iron, which was the wonder material of the early 19th centuries, the PVC of the day.
So, if this isn't a medieval castle, then why did someone spend a fortune making it look like one? And did those sturdy defensive walls ever actually see a battle?
This place was commissioned by the wealthy industrialist Lloyd Hesketh in 1812. It was the largest structure to be erected in Britain in the 19th century, and at its peak boasted an estate of over 6,000 acres.
Many said that Hesketh was a dreamer, but he had a bold and ambitious plan, one that he hoped would influence architecture forever.
It all seems to centre around the loss of his mother when he was around about 11 or 12. And he wanted to build a monument to her and to immortalise her in architecture.
This was Lloyd Hesketh's masterpiece, a lavish 19th century imitation of a much earlier time. Quex Castle.
So in Wales, we are famous for the medieval castles of the native princes, and Lloyd knew this when he was building here, and he set about looking back at the medieval castles, but also all the medieval manuscripts, working out how they actually did it properly.
It is a hugely significant structure, as it was the first Gothic folly in all of Europe.
Lloyd's dream may have come true, but this story doesn't have a happily ever after ending. A bitter family feud was brewing. The horrors of war were on the horizon, and a ghostly presence would soon make itself felt.
Hesketh lived in this castle for many years. It was his home, and then it got passed down through his family, eventually coming into the ownership of his granddaughter in 1894.
Inheriting the castle and the estate meant that the Countess of Dundonald was a woman of very great means. Like her grandfather before her, she left her mark on the castle in a very unique way.
The Countess added her own touches to the building, including this grand marble staircase, and her influence can still be felt here. But it was her political activities that caused a real stir, and that may have sowed the seeds for what was to come.
She was a very strong-minded person who fought heavily for women's rights and was a key figure in the suffragette movement. This was extraordinary at the time, but apparently the marriage was a very unhappy one, and her husband treated her cruelly.
She was really very forward-thinking, and I think this was very disturbing to her husband. He was a Victorian gentleman, really, that he should have complete control, and she refused.
What's astonishing was that in 1906, she did something that was unheard of. Bear in mind that her husband had all of the power over this property. She actually banished him from the castle and cut him out of her will entirely.
For 20 years, right up until her death in 1924, the Countess managed the estate alone. When she died, it was put up for sale. But its story was far from over.
As it turns out, the Countess's estranged husband wouldn't let things lie. He bought back the castle.
And he bought it back out of spite. And it was a great tragedy that occurred, that he destroyed all of her papers. The contents of the castle were sold off. And his parting shot was that he said to the children that no member of the family shall ever live here again.
According to legend, the Countess took her revenge from beyond the grave.
Just a few years after the Countess's death, her estranged husband bought the castle. He sold off much of the contents to finance the purchase, but he was determined to make it his again.
Shortly after the collection was broken up in 1928, people started to see a figure on the marble staircase. A woman seen walking down the stairs and also in the gardens. One of the most famous sightings was by a boxer called Randolph Turpin, who was training in the park, and he saw this woman in white walking towards him, crying, and then he turned to ask what was wrong, and she disappeared.
Despite the rumors of hauntings and the appearance of apparitions, Quex eventually became an unlikely place of hope for children fleeing the horrors of Nazi tyranny during the Second World War.
This was a time when World War II was on the horizon, And Britain knew only too well what this would mean for the children. So what it did was it evacuated 10,000 predominantly Jewish children from Germany, Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia to Britain.
It was known as the Kindertransport, and the children were taken to farms, foster homes and schools across the country, with 200 of them coming here to the castle.
It would have been heart-wrenching for these children to be pulled away from their parents at such a young age, brought to a completely foreign country. But what is truly horrifying is these children were often the only surviving members of their family after the Holocaust.
After the war, the castle opened its doors to the public, one of the first country houses in Britain to do so. That was until 1985, when maintenance costs finally became too high. As a result, the castle was closed, and it quickly fell into disrepair.
The castle was extensively looted and vandalized, reduced to a derelict shell. But then the final blow came when a fire broke out and caused devastating damage to the structure.
For years, the castle sat neglected and forgotten, until an 11-year-old boy fell under its spell. The fairy tale had one final twist.
So I would pass the castle every day to and from school, and it really kind of invoked something in me wanting to save the place. And that drove me on to set up the trust.
Mark now leads a team dedicated to restoring Quex Castle to its former glory and to securing its future for generations to come.
In its short life, the castle has seen many fascinating and important events. Hopefully it can be brought back from the dead so that it can do so again.
In the busy harbour of Lorient, on the west coast of France, there is a colossal relic.
As you approach the structure, you can see from miles away how big they are.
It's in stark contrast to what's surrounding it. You've got these beautiful luxury yachts and villas, and then you've got this concrete, what some would call a monstrosity.
What you see are identical, massive structures, just like this one, and you realize you're not dealing with just one structure, you're dealing with an entire complex of structures.
What are these enormous structures? And what part did they play in the longest continual battle of World War II?
They are oppressive in their scale. They are absolutely huge, sat there on the waterline.
Vast concrete chambers, heavy metal doors. Whatever its original purpose, this place appears to have been built to withstand more than just the elements.
There's nothing fragile about the construction of this. It looks absolutely solid. There's superficial damage in places, but this is in no way going to collapse in the next few years.
But then when you go to other parts, you can see they're darker, locked away, and those are windows to this structure's rather sinister past.
What you have is a strange-looking man-made concrete tunnel with large beams and the light coming down. You really wonder what kind of facility this is.
What do the spooky submerged vessels lying in the harbour tell us about this strange place?
Why are there ships sunk out the front of these structures? Was this a scene of a battle or something else?
Construction here began 2 years into the Second World War. At this dark time in the history of Europe, the French people were living under the terror of Nazi occupation. What was hidden inside these walls struck fear into the hearts of the Allied forces.
1940 was a game changer for the Axis powers. Germany went from having just a small area on the Baltic that could access the seas from to having the whole of the coastline of France. And that changed the face of warfare for the next few years.
And what this meant was that there was a change in focus for the Nazis. It went from very much a land-based war to be much more focused on the sea, and in particularly the Atlantic.
This place was so important to the Germans, they went to extraordinary lengths to protect it.
What made this place so great for the Nazis, and at the same time dangerous for the Allies, was the design of the roof.
The roof construction itself is a very clever, well-thought-out piece of engineering to protect what's below from the threat from the skies.
Maritime historian Christoph Serino is an expert on the stronghold.
The roof comports three parts. We are in the middle of the roof. That's the empty space. Just upstairs, you have concrete beam, and downstairs, you can imagine 3-4 meters of concrete.
The three-part design was repeated across the entire structure. A concrete frame sitting above a solid roof some 10 feet thick.
What we see here with the beams across the top is they're almost sacrificial. If a bomb was to hit those, they could break but not threaten the main structure below. They're to absorb the energy and thus protect your structure below.
The design of the roof didn't mean there was no damage. There was just no damage to the actual bit that needed protection.
What deadly weapon were the Nazis working so hard to protect from Allied bombers?
Now, the Germans have lost the greater part of their surface fleet, damaged or destroyed in the Norway campaign. But the German Navy has one weapon with which it can bring a great deal of power and force against Great Britain, and that's the U-boat.
To house their deadly submarines, the Third Reich built this, the Karaman U-boat base, the largest submarine facility of its kind on the west coast of France.
In order for the U-boats to be most effective, they needed a quick way to resupply, refuel, and then get them back out in the sea. And that's what this structure was all about.
You can see the effort that was put into building it. It is absolutely vast, and it rises up, and it just this massive, imposing temple to U-boats, and it completely dominates the area.
We are here in the third bunker built at the beginning of 1942 and achieved the beginning of 1943. So nearly 12 months to realize this huge bunker.
From here and 4 other sites along the French west coast, the battle for the Atlantic was fought. It was the longest continuous campaign of the entire war. The Atlantic was a vital theater for Germany.
It was basically a different way of fighting. It was picking off the enemy, hiding in the shadows.
Britain is an island. It has to import key raw materials, it has to import men, has to import oil. And if the Germans can establish an effective submarine blockade against Great Britain, they can win the war.
After the fall of France, Germany's newly won access to the Atlantic meant that its navy was able to attack and sink 3,500 British merchant vessels. In one devastating week alone, German U-boats destroyed 27 Royal Navy ships.
We're talking millions of tons of shipping that goes down, and shipping and carrying supplies, carrying personnel, carrying oil and raw materials.
This kind of warfare became very successful for the Nazis, and so obviously when you find something successful, you invest in it, and that's exactly what they did.
Winston Churchill said, the one battle that kept him awake at night was the Battle of the Atlantic, which lasts from 1939 until the last day of the European War, 1945.
For the Allies to be able to stay in the war, the German U-boat bases had to be attacked and destroyed.
I've seen some of the aerial photographs that were taken post-mission, and 500-pound, 1,000-pound bombs, direct hits all over these massive concrete structures, and they barely chip the concrete.
Underneath this modern protective shelter, you can see a bomb crater. You can see that there was damage caused to the roof. But what you can also see is that that damage is contained. It didn't go through to the actual building.
It wasn't just the roof of the base that seemed to be impregnable. Every inch was designed with defense in mind. There were gun emplacements on top, and in the waters in front, makeshift torpedo barriers were built.
Those boats were scuttled at strategic positions, so if a low-flying bomber came in, it would be those shipwrecks that would take the impact and not the U-boat that's being repaired.
How did Allied aircraft attack the heavily defended U-boat bases? And were they ever able to destroy them? In France, during World War II, Allied aircraft were trying to destroy German U-boat pens. For many Allied pilots, attacks were little more than suicide missions.
You can imagine nearly 600 bunkers with radar, radio, anti-aircraft guns, with the protection by the sea. So for the plane, the situation was very, very dangerous. And we have many wrecks near Lorient, sent by German anti-aircraft guns.
A new approach was clearly needed to give the Allies any hope of success. But the change of tactic was very bad news indeed for the town of Lorient.
The Allies very quickly realised exactly how impenetrable these U-boat pens were, and they focused their efforts on the town beyond.
Something like 95% of that town was taken out. And that meant houses, that meant water, that meant supplies.
By disrupting the supply lines, by taking out the railway lines, bringing the raw materials down, they hoped that they would be able to put an end to the U-boat activity.
Although the Allied bombers had failed to destroy the submarine base, they were much more successful in crushing its supply lines.
You can see there looks like what would be a fourth bunker, and it was just that. It was going to be a fourth bunker. But during the Allied bombing, they just couldn't continue its construction.
But success came with a heavy price for the people of Lorient. Hundreds paid for it with their lives.
The only way to stop the building of the submarine base here, the only solution for the Allied and the terrible, is to destroy the town.
After the war, Keraman lay abandoned only briefly. Soon, the French Navy moved in.
The Second World War left a legacy of huge, unique structures across Europe, one of which is this massive submarine refueling station. What do you do with something like this? It's difficult to repurpose it to something civilian. So the French Navy continued to use it for decades afterwards.
Today, some of those extraordinary concrete structures have been repurposed. They are now homes to a host of commercial enterprises, including a theatre. But there is also a museum which keeps the history of Keraman very much alive. On the banks of the mighty Mississippi River, just north of Triumph, Louisiana, USA, a structure emerges from the thick foliage beyond the levee.
Southern Louisiana is a land that is just sinking into the sea. Everywhere you look, there's water, strips of land. And then here you see this large structure.
You know you've come across something important when you see blocks of granite, masonry, concrete. Somebody put a substantial structure there.
It's in such a swampy place. There's something that looks like a drawbridge. There must have been a reason to build something so imposing here.
Across the drawbridge, inside the surrounding moat, an unusual complex is revealed.
It's quite a sophisticated structure. I mean, you come in and you see these huge vaulted galleries extending off into the distance, built at tremendous cost.
But this mysterious site doesn't stand alone. Across the river, a second set of ruins are being slowly submerged.
This place is clearly on its way to being washed out to sea. It shows a lot of damage and destruction.
The two are obviously linked, but what left them in this condition? And how did they work together during a pivotal moment in American history? This is Fort Jackson, a long-forgotten relic with a fascinating history. Once the scene of bitter conflict, it helped shape the future of America. James Madeira is an expert on the ruins' turbulent past and is fighting to preserve its remains.
Because we're almost 90 miles away from New Orleans. Most people don't even realize this place is here. It's part of our history and our heritage.
One thing that makes this fort so impressive is that it got built at all and at such a scale in this very difficult area where transportation is difficult. There's no firm foundation to build on.
Ex-Marine Mark Sauer knows better than anyone how treacherous trying to build in this region can sometimes be. From above, the challenging nature of the terrain becomes clearer.
We're headed to Fort Jackson. As you can see, the terrain mostly all swampland and intermingled canals. This is an area that is nearly cut off from the rest of the world and just very difficult and challenging to get to.
When construction here began in 1822, engineers found a novel way to overcome the difficulties of building on a swamp.
They literally laid down logs of cypress as a foundation. It sounds crazy, but that could sink down into the muck and then create a firm, stable platform upon which to build this massive brick structure.
It's a beautiful thing. It has its origins in these bastion forts that they were building in Renaissance Italy, which were considered this huge innovation in warfare because the fort is shaped like a star.
Modeled on European castles that were built 4 centuries earlier, the layout was designed to inflict maximum damage on an invading army.
The importance of that shape is always because a cannon has a wider sweep on a point, as well as the opposing force would have to basically go around more edges where you could possibly pick them off with your sharpshooters or your bastion cannons that go from side to side.
That's what's really interesting. Even though this thing is built in the 1800s, it's basically rooted in the 1400s. In this period, this fort was regarded as being almost invincible.
Enormous effort was required to build the fort. Whoever was responsible must have had something very important indeed to protect. The key to understanding what it was lies in the great Mississippi River.
You simply can't underestimate how important the Mississippi was to American history, and still is. It's like a superhighway leading into the heartland of the country. If you wanted to move a lot of goods and men, you did it by boat in that part of the country, or you didn't do it at all.
This locale is on the river right before it bends towards New Orleans into the United States, so it's really a strategic point.
And defending New Orleans was a big, big issue from the very time that the United States acquired the territory.
So who ordered the construction of Fort Jackson? And from whom did New Orleans need protecting? To find out, we need to investigate the crumbling relic on the opposite side of the river.
I mean, you can see the remains of a pretty bad state of disarray due to the high water, the currents, and the uncertainty of the location.
This is Fort St. Philip, which was built by the Spanish in 1792, a time when the USA was not in control here. But Fort Jackson was built some 4 decades later.
This region of the Gulf of Mexico was one that was actually contested among the great powers for a long time. Spain claimed it at first, and then France controlled it. The early United States famously purchased Louisiana from France, and so it kept trading hands, but everyone recognized it had enormous strategic importance.
After the purchase of Louisiana in the early 1800s, the fort passed into the hands of the fledgling American states. And when the US was fighting to maintain independence from the British Empire, it was going to be called into action. The War of 1812 was coming.
Britain attempted to attack New Orleans, which was a pivotal port at that time. The ground troops attacked, and some warships tried to sail up the Mississippi to join that attack. They were beaten back by the gunneries in this fort. They weren't able to get past this particular bend in the river.
Having denied it Navy support, the American troops under General Andrew Jackson were able to completely rout the British Army. If the British warships had been able to get through, the outcome could have been very different.
Fort St. Philip is really instrumental in the American victory in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. This is the moment when Britain gives up on its dream of reconquering the American colonies and bringing them back into the British Empire.
From a strategic point of view, what we learned from the War of 1812 was it was very important to defend the lower Mississippi and defend New Orleans. And having forts on the lower Mississippi could make that possible.
Following the close call with the British, Jackson became convinced that another fortification was needed to protect the largest city in the South.
Jackson was a national hero. He was considered a military genius and a brave, swashbuckling character. So his word carried a lot of weight, but in fact, his military advice was dead on. I mean, this was an absolutely crucial avenue for the young country to control.
What was the fortification proposed by Jackson? And what ingenious piece of engineering did it employ? It took a decade, but the stronghold, named after the man responsible for it, was eventually ready for action. Now, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip were able to work together to repel enemy attacks.
Plaquemines Bend in the Mississippi River is at such an angle that any sailing ship at the time, predates 1860s, would have been very subject to bombardment from the opposing bank, which would have been Fort St. Philip at the time. By having this fort on the west bank and having them trapped between these two forts is incredibly dangerous for the sailing ships.
There was another ingenious piece of engineering that made the two forts even more deadly.
The forts were designed to complement each other. They would run an underwater chain between the forts to block any river traffic. So any ships trying to push up the river would be caught on this chain, they'd be hung up, and then they'd be exposed to fire from the casemates of the fort facing the river. And they'd be annihilated in this crossfire. So it made it exceedingly difficult for anybody to contemplate an attack on New Orleans or an attack up the Mississippi River into the heart of America.
It would be another 3 decades before the defenses of Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip were put to the test. This time, the enemy was no foreign army. The threat came from much closer to home.
You have to remember, at the start of the Civil War, New Orleans was one of the world's top port cities, and a massive quantity of goods were traveling through it every day. So whoever controlled it really had their hands around the windpipe of the economy of the South.
In 1862, the two forts were under the command of the Confederacy. Union Admiral David Farragut was determined to break through the blockade. And so he moved his 40 ships upriver.
About a week before the battle, there was barges, wooden schooner hulls that were stretched between the two forts, and chain links were linked to each one of them.
Farragut's fleet approached on the morning of the 18th of April.
Their ships are equipped with the newer heavy guns. They also bring in a lot of smaller boats equipped with large mortars. Now, the one vulnerability that these old-style forts had is they were pretty vulnerable to mortar fire. That means high trajectory coming up and down and landing explosive shells in the middle of the fort.
Farragut's ships unleashed a fierce barrage on the 1,000 Confederate troops holed up inside.
The bombardment of over 8,100 projectiles coming at this fort in Fort St. Philip must have been incredible. We had brave men that were fighting hard, that didn't know the outcome of what was going to happen after the thunderous cannons had been rocketing this place from those ships for hours and hours and hours.
The Confederate garrisons of these forts would have been subjected to just really hellish bombardment. They were taking, more than 1,000 rounds a day from these Union warships.
For 5 murderous days, the Union fleet bombarded the forts as they attempted to break through. Meanwhile, Union soldiers somehow cut the linking chain between the two forts. It was all part of a daring plan.
They had to get past these two forts, and Farragut did something really brilliant. They could have tried to wait, bombard the forts until they overpowered them, but it's very hard firing cannons from a ship to overpower a fort with unlimited ammunition and many more cannons, all protected by many feet of solid brick. So he decided to lead his ships around that bend in the river, between the two forts, knowing they would be taking fire from both sides, in a single file. But he did it at night, when the clouds of smoke and darkness would somewhat obscure his ships, and he gambled they could get through.
Using artillery at night is a very iffy proposition, even for well-trained troops in those days. Both sides were blazing away with every gun they had.
Amid the noise and confusion, 13 Union ships managed to break through the blockade. The route to New Orleans now lay open. Downriver, the Union success had a devastating effect.
The morale effect of this Union victory at Fort Jackson is huge. I mean, downriver you see a complete collapse of Confederate resistance as, Confederate ships surrender, Confederate troops along the river surrender, and pretty soon this important tract of the Mississippi is entirely controlled by the Union, facilitating a push up the river.
New Orleans had fallen. But what became of the Confederate troops that remained inside the forts?
Any Civil War army has real problems with disease. And you put people way out in the swamps of southern Louisiana on malarial climate, sitting until they're attacked. This is not really something that's going to work for your troop morale.
They were fed up, they were dispirited, the conditions were terrible. They actually mutinied, they refused to fight anymore, and they walked out, which meant that when the Union Army came to take these forts, they were able to do it without firing a shot.
Fort St. Philip and Fort Jackson had managed to survive the Civil War. But what accounts for the great damage to them we see today?
You have hurricane season that starts 1 June through 1 November every single year. And just that warm water from the Caribbean and then from the Gulf of Mexico that generates those storms. And just the way it kind of channels them in up through the lower portion of Louisiana. It is truly something that you're eagerly awaiting and praying that a storm doesn't directly hit you.
Since the 1960s, there's been several hurricanes, none worse than Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Devastated this fort, 17 foot of water settled in for 6 weeks.
Although badly damaged, Fort Jackson survived the hurricane. But on the other side of the river, Fort St. Philip fared less well.
What ultimately leads to the destruction, it's not a war, it's not an attack, it's not an assault, it's nature.
Their position on the Mississippi Delta puts the forts very much at the mercy of the elements. While Fort St. Philip is all but gone, Fort Jackson may well have a brighter future.
We're trying to get the National Park Service to take this over, or a local effort just try to save it. It's part of our history and our heritage. The battle here was one of the bloodiest in the Civil War history, but not just the battle. The people that were here, there's lives and stories that are untold.
These forts are important to preserve because they tell part of the story of the United States and really world history, because this part of Louisiana and New Orleans and the Mississippi was a crossroads of global trade, a crossroads of many nations, many different peoples, and that's what's so fascinating about it, and it's not as well understood as it should be.
Now they are abandoned, crumbling ruins. Many remind us of dark times, but some were once beacons of hope and progress, lasting testimonies to human imagination, enterprise, and spirit.